he repeated, this time enunciating each word with force. Reason for being here? If not, then get out. A white cop, screaming like a rabid beast, dragged a black woman into the courthouse, completely unaware that she was a federal agent. He thought she was just another out-of-place skin color loitering around the courthouse grounds. A few minutes later, he was the one being handcuffed in front of the entire courtroom. Want to know exactly what shook the entire legal system in just 10 minutes? Watch until the very last second. Her silence was the heaviest indictment of all. Are there stories like this where you live? Do you still believe in American justice? Leave a comment and let us know. The courthouse courtyard at 10 a.m. was nearly silent, with only the sound of wind sweeping along the polished white stone steps. The woman walked slowly, her fitted orange suit radiating professionalism. Her hair was neatly tied up, her white collar slightly open, just enough for the sunlight to reflect along her throat, forming a quiet but defiant streak of brightness. Her walk was not overly confident, but something about her presence was steady, commanding the quiet space around her to draw back and make room. From behind the glass, Rick Halverson had spotted her even before she crossed into the hallway's threshold. He was on duty, holding a cup of cold coffee, his eyes lazily scanning the movements on the security monitors. But the woman's image was not on the screen. She appeared before him in person, flesh and blood, as if she had silently passed through every layer of surveillance without leaving a trace. He didn't need time to assess. Her skin color had already been decided for him. Rick pushed open the door and stepped out of the guard room, his hand resting in his holster. He approached like he was about to detain a known criminal. When there were only 3 steps between them, he stopped, blocked her path without explanation, and spoke in a commanding, low voice. "Stop! Who do you think you are, wandering around here?" The woman paused. Her gaze was neither startled nor dismissive. She tilted her head and looked at him as if weighing whether to answer the question or let silence speak for her. She chose to speak. Her answer was short, audible, and free of tension. "I'm surveying the premises as scheduled." Rick narrowed his eyes, curling his lip. He looked her over from head to toe, his judgment thinly veiled. There was more than suspicion in that glance. It was disdain wrapped in a professional facade. His voice lowered, hoarse and abrasive. "I don't care. The only black thing around here is the dirt on the ground." She didn't flinch. This silence wasn't a choice. It was a restrained storm settling in her eyes, drawing a cold line between the two of them. The woman didn't step forward or back, simply watching him as if observing a primitive creature that had stepped out of an uncivilized age. Rick thought she would talk back, lash out like others he had grabbed before, giving him reason to call for backup. But in front of him was a silence that didn't invite, didn't yield, and refused to be manipulated. That caught him off guard, then irritated him. That silence was a rejection he couldn't control, couldn't twist into a charge, couldn't mold into a favorable report. He took half a step back, then turned to block the path entirely. "I'll ask again, what are you doing around here?" His voice hardened, his hand now fully gripping the gun handle. No one had ordered him to do that, but for him, resting a hand on a weapon before asking was routine, not an exception. The woman exhaled lightly through her nose, as if the question itself had grown too worn to deserve debate, but she still answered, this time slower, steadier. "You're abusing your authority." The words weren't loud or heavy, but they sliced like a cold blade across the quiet stone. Rick scoffed. "Abusing authority? With you?" he sneered, spitting on the ground. "You should be grateful I'm letting you stand here and talk. Usually I'd have called for backup by now." She said nothing, but her eyes no longer focused on his face. They looked through him, as if he were just a surface blocking her from what she truly needed to do there. Rick didn't see it. He thought he had cornered prey. What he didn't know was that his next move would ignite an explosion he could never put out. The woman kept her gaze steady as Rick's final words fell into the hallway. No one else was present at that moment, only the faint clink of metal in his jacket pocket and the familiar scent of sweat from power that believed itself untouchable. His words did not feel out of place. They stemmed from a habit buried deep in his core. Every word he spoke required no thought, like a survival reflex honed by years of suppressing those he considered beneath him. He was not trying to keep order, he was testing the limits of another person's endurance. Selene Ward looked directly at Rick, still standing in the sunlight. That calmness was not something he was used to facing. He preferred disorder, people stepping back, reacting, raising their voices, or trembling. But in front of him was a face that did not move, not even a softening of expression. She was not flustered, not frowning, not glancing around for an exit. Instead, she quietly observed Rick as if reading a familiar blueprint, each tendon on his neck exposing an ideology abandoned since the last century. Rick shifted his weight onto his right foot and stepped forward. The distance between them now was close enough to hear each breath. His hand dropped from the grip of his gun to the radio at his hip, lightly pressing the signal button, then pretending nothing had happened. He leaned slightly and spoke. "I'm asking seriously, who gave you the appointment? Which department? And what's the reason you're walking around the courthouse perimeter without going through the check?" She lowered her eyes in a single breath, then looked up, her voice steady and clear. "The Office of Federal Infrastructure Security authorized me. The appointment was issued through the internal system. I am not obligated to explain myself to you." Rick tightened his jaw. He disliked being excluded from the chain of authority. He was used to being the one asking questions, not being reminded of procedural boundaries. Her confidence was not luck or stubbornness. It came from a foundation he could not define. A black woman, speaking precisely, unshaken, unapologetic, standing in the hallway he was assigned to secure. In Rick's mind, those two images could not coexist, and he refused to accept that unfamiliarity. He turned slightly, adjusted his stance to block her path fully. This time, it was provocative. "You know, I have the right to detain anyone exhibiting suspicious behavior around the judicial complex, and you've been suspicious from head to toe." He growled the last words like he wanted them carved into the wall. Selene slowly shifted her body, stepping lightly to the side, relieving part of the pressure his presence imposed. "You are deviating from your role. Everything you do after this sentence will be remembered," she said. Rick narrowed his eyes, smirking, stepping closer, and spoke almost in a whisper, just loud enough not to be lost in the breeze. "You remember it, but I'll make sure it leaves a mark." As the words left his mouth, Rick reached out and yanked the file bag from Solene's hand, the sudden motion pulling the strap sharply against her shoulder. The jolt was enough to make a passerby glance, but not enough to cause a scene. Selene kept hold of the strap, did not let go, her posture upright, her eyes fixed on his face. "Touch me again and you'll be writing your report in red ink," she said, her voice carrying steel for the first time. But Rick was familiar with pushing things further than necessary, as long as he was not the one to back down first. And this time, he had no intention of stopping. Rick pressed in, leaving no room for her to turn away. His shadow fell across the white wall behind, one arm casually bent at the waist, as if the gun were decorative, but it was the other hand he meant to highlight. His index finger tapped against the polished badge on his chest, each click a reminder that he stood above the law. He leaned forward slightly, eyes unblinking, a mix of cigarette stench and stale mask breath clinging to his collar. He didn't need to shout, because the authority was in his posture, in the way he used his body to build a wall that denied her all freedom of movement. "Papers?" Rick repeated, enunciating each word with force. "Reason for being here? If not, get out." Selene didn't respond immediately. Her breathing remained steady, unshaken by the sudden block. Her hand gripped the bag strap firmly, eyes locked with the line of his collar, as if gauging the exact distance needed to avoid an instinctive defense move. Any sudden motion could be twisted into resistance, and Rick knew that. He waited, provoked, demanded a reaction. Any flicker of expression that could justify the escalation he was already preparing for. She knew he needed a pretext, and she offered him nothing useless. She tilted her head, met his stare, and spoke just loud enough. "You're using your body to obstruct a citizen performing an authorized duty." Rick laughed like it was the slow punchline to a stale joke. He nodded, eyes never leaving her face, then flicked his glance to the hallway camera mounted near the ceiling. "You think I don't know how to talk to your kind? Think I'm scared of audio logs or written reports?" Celine didn't move. Rick stepped back half a beat, only to close in again, this time his shoulder brushing the wall, creating a coarse rasp that broke the silence. "I've dealt with dozens of civilians in disguise. You think that shiny leather bag and your actress walk make you trustworthy?" She didn't nod, didn't smile. She simply studied every crease on his forehead, every vein swelling in his arm as he held his calculated distance. She knew Rick wasn't speaking to gather information. He was testing obedience. He spoke not to hear, but to dominate. His questions had no question marks, only colons and periods of force. "You're fabricating a case," she said, her tone slicing against the wall, "and I have evidence your actions are being recorded." Rick turned toward the camera, then abruptly pointed at her, his lips almost brushing the air between them. "I don't need evidence, I have authority. And I've just identified a suspicious individual in a sensitive area, refusing to provide documents when asked. Suspicious by what standard? Rick didn't answer. He sneered and suddenly lunged as if to grab her bag again. But Celine shifted sidewise half a step, just enough to slip past the pole. Her eyes changed. Now they were as sharp as a blade unsheathed. She spoke in a low voice, each word driving into the air like a nail. One more move, and I will report you directly to the federal inspector. Rick froze. His eyes narrowed not in doubt, but in irritation. That sentence wasn't a casual threat. It carried the cadence of someone who knew exactly what her authority was and which name to invoke to keep a man like him awake at night. He stared at her for several long seconds, then flicked his hand as if dismissing her. Go, stay away from the courtroom zone. Next time I see you around here, there won't be a warning. Celine stood upright, still facing him, and walked past with deliberate calm. Her footsteps left no echo behind, but Rick remained rooted, his hand clenched on the pistol grip. His eyes trailed her back, still hunting for some detail he could twist into an accusation. But he didn't realize it was that very gaze that had just been exposed before justice, and the real game had only just begun. Celine stood still, both hands gripping the strap of her bag as if holding an invisible boundary. She did not step back, but leaned slightly to the side, shifting away from the physical pressure Rick was using to assert dominance through posture. Her words were not a protest, but a triggered alarm, as if each syllable she uttered was time-stamped and archived in a file Rick had no access to alter. There was no visible defiance, yet every breath she took displayed absolute control, like someone who had seen too much to be shaken by brute force. Rick frowned. He heard every word clearly, and the phrase lawful citizen prompted him to snap back with a clenched voice. You are not a citizen. You are just a polished shell, hollow inside. His tone was dry, each word breaking off like it had been split from a piece of rotting wood. Celine did not respond immediately. Her eyes paused at his chin, then slid down to his badge, where Rick's hand still rested like a false talisman. For those brief seconds, the silence stretched taut between them. Celine was analyzing, not Rick, but what stood behind him, the essence of a system that allowed him to speak those words without hesitation. She looked up. Is that how you see people? Her voice was not heavy, but so light it sliced through the silence like a blade gliding across still water. By appearance and prejudice, Rick let out a short laugh, stepped back half a pace, then leaned in again. I see with instinct, he said, his breath laced with the cheap scent of peppermint drifting within inches of her face. Instinct honed by years of sniffing out lies, enough to know who's real and who's built to cheat the law. Celine curled one corner of her mouth. Her gaze landed on the reflection in the glass at the far end of the hallway, where their silhouettes stretched, warped, and slanted. The only thing cheating the law is the power you are abusing, she said, slowly, each pause deliberate and unwavering. Rick swallowed hard. His face twitched, as if she had just exposed something he had never admitted to himself. But instead of backing off, he tensed his body and returned to the stance of an aggressor. His right hand pressed against the wall behind her, framing her in a narrow space, as though imprisoning her. The gesture was no longer procedural. It was a raw display of control, distorting another person's space to gain dominance. He lowered his voice just enough for her to hear without it carrying too far. "You think you're better than me? With that attitude, I can put you on the watch list before you say another word." Soline kept her breathing steady. She turned her head, eyes scanning the camera at the end of the corridor, then looked back into his. "That list will take you straight to the Oversight Committee. No intermediary needed." Rick clenched his teeth. He did not back away, but his palm against the wall began to sweat. Nothing was unfolding the way he had anticipated. She did not lower her voice, did not retreat, and, most importantly, did not resist in a way he could convert into a pretext for detainment. Every one of her movements was calculated, so precisely that her restraint itself left him powerless. He had pushed, but she had not stepped back, and that was the most dangerous thing of all. "This is your final warning," Rick said, his tone shifting to a form of coercion. "Either you give me a convincing reason, or I take you inside and handle you like any other disruptor." Celine tilted her head to the right, as if gauging the width of the hallway behind him. She replied without hesitation, "I'm ready to go inside, but the first person to be questioned will not be me." That sentence landed and froze Rick for a second, just long enough for his shadow to shift away from her, creating a small space for her to step lightly to the left. Light returned to her collar like a blade slicing the air, redrawing the physical boundary between the two figures standing face to face. Rick realized it, and he hated that more than any word she had spoken. Rick reached out without warning, yanking Celine's bag from her shoulder as if seizing dangerous evidence. The strap pulled taut, jerking her shoulder, but her body didn't sway. She held firm, hand locked in place, eyes fixed on him like a block of dense ice, deep and utterly unmoved. Every knuckle clenched tighter on the strap, yet she didn't remove his hand. She let him see the madness of the choice he had just made. "Standard search, do not resist," Rick growled, eyes blinking rapidly as if convincing himself that his action was necessary, justified, and lawful, but his voice and behavior were out of sync. He had no witness, no written report, and no proper procedure. He acted on instinct, the kind shaped by a career of masking personal judgment with authority. In that moment, the handbag became a symbol of self-agency he intended to strip away without cause. Celine did not budge, maintaining her grip and responding with the one sentence Rick could not interrupt. "You have no warrant. I have every reason to sue you." The words struck him like a slap, not because of the content, but because of the tone. It was not a threat. It was a verdict delivered early, full, needing no defense. Rick tightened his grip, tugged again, but failed. She remained steady, gaze unbroken. "You're obstructing a law officer," he barked louder, as if raising the volume would validate the act, even though the hallway remained empty. Volume was the only lever Rick could adjust to drown out the growing dissonance inside him. Celine looked at him, her eyes like a mirror that flipped every lie back at him. He knew she understood exactly what he was doing, what lines he had crossed, and how it would be remembered. "I haven't resisted. I am protecting personal property from an illegal act." Her answer came fast, clear, without a single wasted word. Each word was like a lock sealing the space Rick was thrashing in. He breathed hard, eyes darting, then lowered his voice to keep echoes from carrying. "You think I don't know your kind, always sneaky with tricks? You think I haven't been fooled by harmless-looking faces before? You weren't fooled because they were good at hiding. You were fooled because you trust your instincts too much." Celine responded cleanly, releasing the strap but remaining still. The move wasn't a surrender. It was a transfer of responsibility. If Rick pulled the bag now, he would be committing theft in a government building with no valid cause, and he knew it. He didn't pull. His hand hovered mid-air, then slowly let go. Beads of sweat rolled down his temple and jawline. Some of it came from the sunlight pouring through the glass ceiling, but most from the realization that he had lost control. In front of him was not someone vulnerable, not someone needing protection. She stood like someone who had long awaited this moment, where truth didn't need to scream but could still suffocate lies. Soline's shoulder was suddenly gripped tightly, her body forced forward. Rick clutched her arm like a clamp, dragging her down the hallway with his rushed footsteps. The force was not a lawful escort, but a violent display, more vengeance than enforcement. Soline balanced each step without struggling, but her eyes turned back toward two staffers pressed against the wall. One was a young judicial assistant holding a file box, the other a security tech. Both stood frozen, not because Rick's action was shocking, but because it was disturbingly familiar. Too much like scenes they had seen and never dared to name aloud. Rick dragged her like a trophy, heels clapping sharply against the tile. Near the intersection of two corridors, he raised his radio and shouted, "I just caught a fox in disguise wandering the courthouse. Bringing her in." The words echoed through the PA system, prompting a few checkpoint staff to glance at each other, unsure if it was a breach or a legitimate arrest. One of them started to step forward, but Rick raised a hand to block him, kept walking, and gave no explanation. He pushed Soline onward, forcing her toward the wing that led directly to the courtroom. Her wrist twisted awkwardly, arm straining from the angle. Still, Soline said nothing. Each of her steps was measured, never letting Rick fully control the direction. She knew what he was doing was not a mistake. It was a choice. Every word he had just yelled through the radio was not to report the situation but to craft a narrative. He had no evidence, but he was trying to create enough confusion to make everyone believe she was the issue, so that her identity verification would be buried under layers of assumptions. Soline could sense the curious eyes beginning to follow them from the open doors on either side, people trying to understand what was happening but too hesitant to intervene. As they approached the courtroom door, Rick paused for half a second to scan his badge, then jerked his shoulder sharply, signaling her to enter. The door opened, and the entire room fell silent as they walked in. A judge who had just placed his pen down from signing a witness summons looked up and frowned at the unusual sight. Patrol behind him were several staff members seated along the side benches, most of whom did not recognize her face, but their expressions quickly shifted as they saw Rick escorting a black woman with his shoulder pressed against hers as if restraining a dangerous suspect. "Clear the way," Rick said loudly, pushing Soline toward the defendant's bench. "I need to keep her here while we wait for further investigation." He spoke as if executing a mission of utmost importance, his eyes sweeping the room to see who was watching. But what he did not expect was the number of faces that could not hide their doubt. A court clerk furrowed his brow, the judge leaned forward in his seat, and from the back row, an older attorney shrugged, as if witnessing a tired old performance. Soline sat down without resistance. Her hand remained on her bag, her eyes scanned from Rick to the security officer near the door, then settled on the presiding judge's seat. Her face showed no anger, no hostility, only a sharp clarity that made those looking at her pause and reconsider every action they were about to take. Rick stepped forward, still holding the radio in his hand, murmuring a few words but never pressing the talk button. He was calculating his next move, but just as he turned to speak to someone beside him, the judge raised his voice, brief but loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Can someone explain clearly what exactly is going on here?" That question was not directed solely at Rick, nor was it a reprimand. It was the system itself beginning to question its course, recognizing that what was unfolding had gone beyond the boundaries of standard procedure, and from that moment on, Rick began to feel he had dragged the entire system into a game where he no longer controlled the rules. The sound of Soline's heels scraping against the polished white stone floor made the hallway feel longer with each step. Every time Rick shoved her forward a bit faster, the edge of her heel would slide slightly, producing a sharp metallic scrape, like steel dragging across porcelain. It felt less like an escort and more like public shaming. Rick's grip tightened, knuckles taut as if restraining something that might lash out at any moment. Even though the woman in front of him showed no sign of fleeing or resisting, her gaze remained steady, fixed forward, refusing to be lured into the visual trap of a man asserting power by pulling a body behind him. Rick leaned his head toward her ear, exhaling heavily, as if trying to push a toxic cloud under her collar. "What's wrong? Not so composed now, are you?" His voice was dry and hard, ground out between clenched teeth, as if each word had been sharpened by resentment. Celine did not turn back. Her steps stayed in rhythm, body balanced against the backward pull. To a passerby, it might have looked like an official detainment, but those observing closely would sense something off about how a well-dressed woman, walking calmly, was being forced through an unexplained process. Rick shoved her shoulder again, this time with more force. Her body tilted, then stabilized, stride never breaking. To him, it felt like dragging a puppet that kept adjusting its center of gravity. That frustrated him. He could not make her stumble, nor provoke a reaction. Every move he made occupied that gray space the law often forgets, but conscience cannot ignore, and Rick did not want to linger there too long. The courtroom entrance ahead opened automatically through facial recognition. As they crossed the threshold, the overhead scanner bathed Soline's face in quiet light. Rick said nothing more, but his breath grew louder, his footsteps heavier, pounding out echoes as if trying to bury the silence she left with every step. They turned into a waiting room typically reserved for witnesses between sessions. The room was small, dimly lit in warm yellow, with scattered plastic chairs, a bulletin board hanging slightly crooked on one wall. Rick paid no attention. He pushed Celine down onto the middle chair, then stood with arms folded, facing the door as if standing guard, though truly trying to look like a legitimate authority figure. Celine looked around, scanning the room without expression. She did not examine or memorize it, only gauged how long she might need to end this conversation. She did not ask why she was being held, did not demand a witness, and did not request a lawyer. None of that was necessary here, not because she was unaware of her rights, but because Rick did not deserve a reminder of them. Rick paced a short loop around the room, pretending to be busy. Part of him felt observed, the rest unsure what to do with a silent woman whose stillness thickened the air. He pulled out his radio, pressed the button without speaking, letting the red light blink before switching it off, a ritual meant to create a sense of justification. Then he turned, planted both hands on the table, and leaned toward her. "I'll ask one last time," Rick said, voice low. "Who are you? What are you doing here? And who authorized your presence?" Celine met his eyes, unblinking, not dodging his gaze like the innocent fearing risk. Her voice rang out, even and cold, like metal tapping against tile. "You're asking the wrong person, and you don't rank high enough to hear the answer." Rick exhaled sharply, lungs expanding as if he had just swallowed a fistful of anger. But before he could respond, the door behind them opened. A man in a security uniform stepped in, holding a file clipboard, scanning the room before lowering his voice. "Excuse me, there's a problem with the gate's recognition system. I was sent to manually verify today's visitor logs." Rick nodded quickly, trying to maintain composure, but his eyes flicked toward Celine like he had just realized the game board no longer belonged to him, and the person he had dragged like a suspect was still controlling the rhythm of the entire room. Celine sat motionless on the misaligned plastic chair under the dull yellow light, back straight, hand resting on the strap of her bag. Her eyes were not on the door, but on the empty wall opposite, as if waiting for a knock that would never come. Her silence did not leave a void. It pressed down on the space so heavily that even the soft footsteps of the entering guard made the room collectively hold its breath. Rick leaned halfway against the desk, gripping the radio tightly even though no command had been issued. He stared at the newly arrived staff member, the one who had opened the door just seconds earlier and stated clearly that the entry recognition system was malfunctioning and all personnel on site needed to have their records checked. Rick said nothing. His gaze hovered somewhere between caution and distrust, as if the person who had just entered was another variable beyond his control. The security officer's footsteps stopped at the threshold. His eyes scanned the room, passed over Rick, then paused briefly on Celine. That look was not suspicion, but a quiet form of comparison, as if something in her posture and demeanor did not align with any disruptive profile he had encountered before. He did not speak yet, simply exhaled softly, and opened his notebook out of habit. Rick spoke through clenched teeth, not loudly, but sharp enough to slice through the thoughts in the room. This room room is already handling a subject with suspicious behavior. You don't need to verify here." The statement halted the newcomer's advance. But for a brief moment, Soline's eyes left the wall, slowly turning to look directly at the officer. She didn't wait to be addressed, didn't signal anything. She simply observed, unblinking, and for the next few seconds, the entire room seemed to contract into the triangle of 3 intersecting gazes. The officer frowned, as if he had just heard something out of tune. He looked at Rick again, then asked, with a tone that was neither firm nor deferential, "Can you show me the detention order? Because if you don't have one, I'm required to record this incident." Rick turned, his expression shifting in an instant, then straightened up as though trying to reclaim the authority slipping from his grasp. "I don't need an order when the detained individual shows signs of disruption inside a secured zone." "Disruption according to which report?" "Based on my assessment at the scene," Rick said, his voice missing half a beat. Soline remained silent. Her hand resting on the bag did not move, but her gaze now settled between the 2 men, as if she were reading their expressions like reviewing a certified document. She did not interrupt, did not interfere, but her presence alone made everything Rick had said feel out of place. The officer opened his notebook but did not write. His hand remained still on the blank page. His eyes scanned once more, then he delivered a short sentence, establishing the record. "I will document this as an incident, with no detention order and no visible resistance." Rick turned his head, eyes locking on Soline like a living accusation, but she did not look back. She had returned to facing the blank wall across from her, maintaining the same posture as before, as if she had completed what needed to be done without ever having moved. The courtroom door swung open with a rough push, its hinges squealing in the still silence. Rick entered first, his hand gripping Soline's shoulder like a living exhibit of the authority he was draining dry. She was shoved toward the defendant's bench, a lone chair set apart from the long rows reserved for attendees. No one in the room understood what was happening, but the appearance of the 2, one standing, one seated, slowed every motion around them. Overhead lights cast a direct beam onto her face, the sterile white glow highlighting deep-set eyes, a firm jaw, and an unnerving calm. Soline neither resisted nor reacted emotionally. She sat upright, hands resting on her lap, her bag pressed tightly against her side. The light did not dazzle her eyes. It illuminated a face untouched by fatigue, even after being dragged down the corridor and into this room. Rick, still breathing heavily from the rush, stood in front of her, forming a barrier between her and the rest of the courtroom. His face flushed, partly from the exertion, partly because the woman's silence left him with no path backward. His voice burst out like a forced detonation, desperate to reclaim control. "Name, residence, purpose for being in this courthouse." The question exploded like a shout, not to gather information, but to suppress any other sound that might emerge. Rick was not seeking answers. He needed affirmation of his role. Yet the courtroom echoed with no reply, and no one rushed to speak. A clerk looked up, pen hovering mid-air above the paper. A lawyer seated to the right tilted slightly, his gaze narrowing. The room was gripped by a single held breath. Soline remained unmoved, her neck still, her gaze fixed. Among the shouted orders and sterile lights, she became an unexpected center, not because of placement, but for her detachment from the chaos others tried to pull her into. Outside the courtroom, a few footsteps paused, as if halted by something unnamed. A phone buzzing in someone's pocket went silent before it could ring. Rick began pacing, moving past her as if trying to provoke a glance. He had not yet realized it was that very silence making him seem out of place. He repeated the question, no longer shouting but each word tight like a bullet chamber. "Why are you here? Who sent you? What is your name?" Soline tilted her head, casting her first look upward since sitting down, locking directly onto Rick's face. Without altering tone or posture, she uttered each word with clarity, like a gavel cracking against the bench. "I am sitting in the exact place you dragged me to." Her voice carried just enough to be heard, not loud, but each person in the courtroom heard it. No reaction followed. Her response offered no details. no defense. It simply held up a mirror in the middle of the room, reflecting Rick's behavior from their first meeting in the courtyard to this moment. And that mirror did not crack. Rick stepped back half a pace, as if something in that moment had ejected him from the spotlight he had screamed to occupy. No one laughed, no one clapped, yet something inside the courtroom changed forever. Solene still sat on the defendant's bench, her posture composed as if rehearsed in advance. Her hands laced gently on her lap, the strap of her bag lay smooth, unbent. She did not look at Rick, nor show any interest in the anger he unleashed only inches away. Her eyes were fixed on the judge's bench, where the presiding official observed without expression. In that gaze, Solene sought neither justice nor approval. It was the gaze of someone who had moved beyond seeking vindication, now merely watching others face their truths. Rick stepped left, turned toward the courtroom, and raised his voice abruptly, as if needing more witnesses for what he was about to declare. She loitered around the courthouse, obstructed an officer in duty, exhibited disruptive behavior. The words boomed through the sound system, bouncing off wood panels and high ceilings, but the echo did not carry the weight he intended. As the words fell, the room stiffened into a slow freeze. Everyone heard them, but no one acknowledged them with a face or a movement. A female clerk furrowed her brow, her pen hesitating just above the paper. The attorney, seated near the door, leaned his chair slightly forward, elbow resting on his knee, his gaze fixed on Solene's face. The judge, meanwhile, kept his eyes forward, uninterrupted, flipping a page in the document stack with one hand, as if verifying more facts before allowing Rick's words to dominate the courtroom atmosphere. Solene remained motionless. Her silence left Rick's accusations hanging mid-air, unanswered. But that very stillness made the room more uncomfortable. If she had responded, the situation would have shifted toward fact-checking. But by staying composed, the accusations came across as one-sided, carrying the tone of propaganda more than a factual account. And that is, as I walk, Rick glanced around, searching for agreement, for a supportive glance, or at least some sign that his words held weight. But the rows of seats remained quiet, marked only by the rustle of turning pages and the faint scratch of pens on paper. The lack of reaction made him more agitated. He braced both hands on the edge of the table, speaking louder this time, directly toward the judge. I followed protocol. She couldn't produce identification, suspicious behavior, uncooperative, deliberately delayed verification, and when prompted, showed signs of physical resistance. A quiet cough rose from the back row. A middle-aged woman adjusted the pocket on her blouse and sat upright, eyes moving from Rick to Solene. Silence returned. Solene did not turn her head, did not lower her gaze, did not conceal anything. Her eyes remained fixed on the judge's bench, locked at the center, where all symbolic authority is positioned to look down upon the accused. But her gaze held no fear, no remorse. It resembled an assessment, as if she were evaluating whether the highest-ranking person in the room truly deserved that position. Rick withdrew his hands from the table, turned halfway, and said nothing more. He stood between two worlds. On one side, the image of the enforcer. On the other, a reality no longer obeying or fearing him. And between those two planes, Solene remained seated, like a charged node waiting for the exact point of contact to release a truth he could no longer stop. The elderly judge, Julius Wainwright, sat still on the high bench, looking down. He did not respond immediately after Rick's statement, but let a silence stretch long enough for the entire courtroom to breathe slower. His aged eyes swept across the faces before him, then settled directly on the center of the confrontation. The man standing before him still gripping his radio, his eyes locking in as though he were the one being interrogated. "You said there was disruptive behavior," Julius asked, his voice low but unwavering. "I need evidence." Rick quickly turned, standing straight, as if having been called out by name. He nodded, though his shoulders remained stiff, and his voice followed without softening. "Unnecessary? Professional instinct. I've dealt with her kind hundreds of times." The reply dropped like a stone, heavy and hollow. The entire room held its posture, as if just having heard a false righteousness shouted too loudly. Julius tilted his head slightly, eyelids half closing before opening again, his gaze now sharp like a blade slicing through the air thick with prejudice. "Professional instinct," he repeated slowly, almost mocking. "So that means you assess criminal behavior based on how she walks, or how she looks at you?" Rick froze for half a second, then raised his chin, as if resolve could compensate for the lack of evidence. No one shows up around a courtroom for no reason, especially someone who remains silent, deliberately avoids cooperating when asked. She displayed defiance, held unidentified items, and refused to provide her. "In my experience, those are red flags." "Unidentified items?" Julius cut in, his tone now slightly edged. "Did you search her? Did you seize anything?" Rick paused, then replied curtly, "No." She pulled the bag back. "I didn't get the chance to proceed by protocol." "And no search warrant either," Julius continued, his eyes fixed on Rick's increasingly tense face, bit down gently on his molars, then nodded slowly. For a moment, every gaze in the room seemed to converge on the center, where Rick was no longer an officer executing duty, but a man clinging to the remnants of authority with nothing but his voice. Celine remained seated, having interrupted no one, but her eyes had now shifted from the judge to Rick, stopping precisely as he lowered his hand. It was not a mocking glance, nor pity. It was the look of someone who had seen this script unfold dozens of times and knew exactly when the writer would lose the pen. Julius pulled a sheet from the folder at his left hand, scanned it, then set it down. He placed both hands on the polished wooden bench, his fingers tapping lightly against the file before speaking. "I request a review of all records concerning the accused's presence, including every recorded image from the hallway, the outer courtyard, and the security checkpoints. In the meantime, Officer Rick Halverson is to withdraw from the courtroom to avoid interfering with the review process." Rick opened his mouth as if to protest, but the words caught in his throat. The room remained silent, no additional pressure needed. His own words had already shifted the balance, and Julius, with a final glance, confirmed what no one else needed to question. From this moment on, the situation was in the hands of someone who understood exactly what the judge's bench meant. A female court officer, seated to the left of the control table, lowered her head to recheck a folder, then looked up slowly. Her eyes landed on Celine once again, this time not to verify anything, but as if searching her memory. She leaned toward her colleague beside her, speaking in a voice low enough not to travel beyond the front row. "She's dressed like a senior advisor." The others furrowed their brow, not yet responding, when both their gazes stopped at a single point, Rick Halverson. His right hand gripped the holster at his hip, fingers clenched so tightly the veins bulged across the knuckles. That posture was not defensive, but a way to squeeze down the surge of helplessness rising violently. Rick's eyes swept across every face, not to seek acknowledgement, but to force them to nod in agreement with his rage. All eyes began to shift away from Rick's line of sight. The judicial clerk from earlier gripped her pen tightly, head bowed as she wrote, the ink pressing more clearly into the page than usual. No one wanted to be the next to get dragged into the emotional violence spiraling within a man desperately clinging to the authority stitched into his uniform. The expressions in the courtroom slowly turned. No one said it aloud, but suspicion passed through every pair of eyes. Celine's skin, her gaze, and the way she sat, none of it matched the picture Rick had tried so hard to paint. Celine remained seated in the same position, still as a period at the end of a sentence, needing no emphasis. The overhead light cast a soft rim around her head. Her posture stood out, but not by seeking attention. It was the stark contrast to Rick's unraveling fury that made the image stay longer in the eyes of those watching. Rick could not draw his weapon. He knew that. but his hand stayed where it was, a reflex clinging to the illusion of control. He turned his head toward Julius, who was scanning through the camera log just handed over by a security officer. No one spoke. No one needed to. Each passing minute pushed Rick closer to the edge, where logic could no longer redeem anything. Julius did not look up. He simply motioned to the clerk to note a request for recess to verify the footage. Rick let out a dry laugh, the kind that hissed through clenched teeth. "Everyone here is fooled by her appearance," he said loudly, no longer restraining himself. "A pale-colored suit and a calm voice, so what? She was still wandering around the courthouse without papers, without identity." A man seated in the second row leaned toward the person next to him, whispering something. Murmurs followed, domino-like. No one raised their voice to refute Rick, but every glance, every lifted eyebrow was questioning his every word. Truth needed no defense when Rick's unraveling had become the clearest evidence in the room. Celine tilted her head slightly, her eyes settling on the officer standing in the center of the room like a storm that had lost direction. She said nothing, but her silence was no longer still. It became a gravitational force, making everything around her sharper, colder, and undeniable. Judge Julius raised his head. He did not look at Rick, but directly addressed the security officer. "I need footage from the main courtyard and the east corridor between 10:15 and 10:30, and a digital log of all federal personnel entries for this morning." Rick stood frozen. That final sentence sliced through the thick armor he had worn since the session began. No one said it aloud, but a single question had now written itself across every face. Who is she? And Rick, with a gun still on his hip, suddenly became the only person in that courtroom without the right to ask. Celine rose from the defendant's bench with a decisive motion that seemed to draw the entire space into its wake. Her back straight, the overhead light still cast over her shoulders, but could no longer keep her within its glare. She stepped away from the predetermined spotlight, silently moving toward the bench, her pace steady, yet each step resonant enough to hold everyone's gaze. Her light brown leather bag was opened with a precise gesture. No rustling, no wasted motion. All eyes suddenly focused on one detail, as Soline's fingers drew out a cold, gleaming metal object from inside. She did not raise it, nor turn it toward anyone in particular. She simply placed it on the wooden surface in front of her, right at the center, beneath the wide-eyed stares of those still struggling to understand. A silver badge, gleaming, catching the overhead light, and the silence slicing across the courtroom. Engraved above were 3 words: United States Federal. Below, in recessed lettering, Special Agent. At the center, a round seal bore the official insignia of the Federal Internal Affairs Division. Undeniable, unmistakable. Celine raised her head. Her voice rang out evenly, loud enough for every person to hear clearly without her needing to raise it. "My name is Celine Ward, Federal Agent. I was dispatched this morning by directive from headquarters in Washington to assist with oversight of the federal special trial sequence for District 3. A man near the front row drew a sharp breath between his teeth. Rick stepped back half a pace, his body reflexively recoiling from the reality just established. His hand still hovered near his holster, but it had lost its strength. His eyes blinked rapidly, avoiding the badge and unable to meet Soline's gaze. It was the look of someone backing away from a collapsing building, knowing it could no longer be held up. Judge Julius did not move at once. His aged eyes rested on the badge, then shifted to Soline's face, and finally to the mouth that had just delivered a statement turning the courtroom into what it truly was, a place where those who enforce the law may find themselves facing it. "Do you have anything to add, Officer Halverson?" Julius spoke slowly, his tone light, yet pressing enough to drop weight over Rick from all directions. Rick said nothing. His cheek twitched, lips pressed tightly, and his hand slowly released the grip on his gun, as if every finger had been drained of power. No one rushed him, but every eye in the room now focused on one point, not the badge, but the space between it and Rick, and the silence that had already written his guilt more clearly than any formal report. Celine remained standing, her gaze composed as if she had never been dragged, never shouted at, never treated like courtroom debris. Yet from that exact position, a line had been drawn that could not be undone, and on the far side of it, Rick Halverson had placed himself into permanent shadow. The courtroom sank into stillness as though it had been flipped upside down by gravity. Everyone stood motionless. Faces remained turned toward the gleaming silver badge on the desk, frozen in a moment that could not be reversed. No one spoke, no one turned. Every breath held tightly between the truth made visible and a pride newly shattered. Rick remained in the center of the room, but now he resembled a statue hollowed out from within. His arms hung slack, sweat ran down from his temple across his cheek, sliding straight to his collar, leaving a glistening trail on the uniform shirt he had so confidently tightened minutes before. He said nothing, eyes wide open, fixed on the badge as if a blink might erase it, as if all of this could be overturned by a single denial. But the silver emblem did not vanish. It stayed exactly where Soline had placed it, still and final, like a verdict that needed no voice. At that exact moment, a voice rose from the back, masculine, deep, and clear. The tone carried no emotion, but it held enough weight to pull the entire room back to reality. "Agent Ward is scheduled to be here under federal directive. She doesn't need your permission." All eyes shifted instantly. A man in a gray suit stepped in, his badge visible beneath his lapel, holding a folder stamped with a red seal. His hair was neatly combed, his gaze not inquisitive but assertive. He walked directly toward Soline, gave her a slight nod as if the two shared a prior understanding, then turned to the bench and placed the file in front of Judge Julia. Rick flinched slightly, like someone snapped back from a vague fall. His mouth pressed tight, his eyes still trying to resist the feeling of being stripped bare. But the words just spoken had left him no room to explain. On the document was a federal order. On the table lay an authentic badge. In front of him stood a certified agent, officially assigned, empowered, and now present as a living verdict on every act he had tried to cover with shouting, pushing, and prejudice. No one needed to ask further. The room understood what had just occurred, and worse, it understood exactly who no longer had a place here. The female clerk glanced at Rick, then looked away. The hallway attorney closed his file, his gaze now visibly firmer. An older man in the third row gave Soline a small nod. Each reaction was subtle, but every one of them cut into the hollow armor of Rick Halverson's authority. Soline said nothing more. She simply bowed her head slightly to the man who had entered, her gaze holding that same depth, not sharp, not submissive. Only one thing was now undeniable. She had never moved from her place, never violated anything, and had never needed the permission of someone like Rick. From the highest seat in the room, Julius Wainwright leaned back in his chair, his eyes following the moment as if he had just witnessed a chess match brought to conclusion with a final move laid perfectly on the board. And in the center of that room, Rick Halverson, with hands still damp with sweat, had written himself into the role of the villain in a hearing he believed he was controlling. Soline stood firm, the overhead light casting a soft halo over the shoulders of her orange blouse. But the true focus now shifted to where her eyes were locked. Without blinking, without hesitation, she looked directly at Rick Halverson, the man who had once dragged her by the arm like an animal across the courthouse lot, who had shouted without mercy to tear down the image of a woman he never bothered to understand. Her voice broke out, each word solid, the tone not carrying anger but stripping away the last facade clinging to the sweat-soaked face before her. "Would you care to repeat the exact slurs you used earlier?" The courtroom tilted toward the sound of that voice. Everyone understood this was no longer about reclaiming dignity. It was a reversal of the board using the very pieces Rick had thrown out just minutes before. Back then he had appointed himself judge, using words to silence. Now, those same words were turning into evidence, and the person across from him had the right to ask questions. Even before the judge himself, Rick froze, his throat moving slightly but producing no sound, his lips pressed, then parted, releasing releasing nothing more than an unformed breath. His eyes darted to the right, toward Julius Wainwright, as if hoping for a way out from a room that was slowly closing in. He spoke, his voice no longer carrying the stiffness it had held before. "I didn't know who she was. You didn't know who I was, so you assumed I wasn't worth respecting." Soline followed. Her tone was even, clear, but carved from stone. "Would you like me to repeat back the words you used toward me just now?" Rick took half a step back, one hand on his hip, his eyes falling to the floor and glancing behind him, as if time might rewind or someone would intervene, but no one spoke. No one interrupted Soline. No one slipped, step by step, no one. The prolonged silence had already become a quiet verdict issued by the entire room. Julius remained silent. He let each question unfold in full without interruption. His role now was no longer the center of control, but the place where truth was being officially observed, undeniable in its slow reveal. He looked at Rick, his eyes sharpening, then gave a subtle nod to Soline as permission to proceed. Soline needed no more prompting. Each of her questions landed like a gavel on an invisible bench between them. No one pulled out a phone to record. No one took notes. Everyone understood that what was happening would be engraved in memory. A police officer using discriminatory language against someone he believed beneath him, undone by the simple truth of her identity. Rick attempted another step back, but that movement only exposed the emptiness inside. Every word he had spoken, every display of dominance he had performed, no longer built a shield around him. Because when you are asked to repeat what you've said and you can't, that is no longer power. It is a confession, pouring out with every unanswered question. Soline took one step forward, the ceiling light casting her shadow long across the cold tile floor. Her face remained composed, but her eyes had shifted tones. She stopped, looked at Rick again, and this time not to interrogate, but to affirm a truth that needed no defense. Her voice rang out, cold and sharp like a clean cut through tempered steel. "You don't need to know who I am to treat me like a human being." That sentence was not a reply to his hesitation, nor was it a personal plea for fairness. It was the final nail driven into the reasoning Rick had clung to all along. The reasoning that allowed him to discriminate, insult, and drag someone simply because of her skin color and her refusal to submit. Soline took a deep breath, turned around, and let her gaze rest on each face in the room. Not too fast, not in passing. Every person in the courtroom felt they were being looked at directly, not with a plea for agreement, but so they would hear clearly what she was about to say. She spoke, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a voice no one could escape. This prejudice is not an accident, it is a system. Each word felt like gravity pulling things to the ground. There was no rebuttal, no correction, because everyone knew she was right. It wasn't the first time a black person had been asked for papers without doing anything wrong. It wasn't the first time someone was treated as a threat simply because they weren't afraid. And it wasn't the first time someone had been forced into the defendant's chair while no one dared to ask who allowed that to happen. Soline stood in the middle of the courtroom. Her frame wasn't large, she wore no protective armor, yet her presence now eclipsed the judge's bench, the attorney's tables, and the gallery seats behind. She wasn't in the center because she had been summoned, but because the actions of others had pushed her there, and now she chose to claim it. Rick still stood off to the side, shoulders slumped, eyes adrift as if he no longer had a sense of direction. The things he had said, the things he had shouted, were now reflected at him through every gaze directed at Soline. And in those eyes there was also shame, shame borne by those who had stayed silent. No one said it aloud, but everyone understood that what Soline had just declared was a testimony to the truth of a system they had long accepted as normal. In that tightening space, Soline still did not retreat. She stood tall, without raising a hand, without needing to single anyone out, because she knew if fingers were to be pointed, the entire courtroom would have to hold up a mirror and face themselves. And in that silence, every word she had just spoken was still echoing, pulsing against the walls, the ceiling, not to accuse, but to begin peeling away the final mask they had all worn for far too long. The silver badge still lay motionless on the courtroom bench, its edges catching the overhead white light like a cold incision into the lacquered surface of what had long been called justice. Judge Julius did not take his eyes off it as he lifted his gavel in one deliberate but unhurried motion. He tapped it lightly against the wood, 3 low thuds cutting off the last remnants of twisted reasoning that had just been exposed. "Detain Officer Rick Halverson for 72 hours, Julius declared, his voice steady but so clear it required no repetition, "for internal investigation into abuse of authority and racially discriminatory behavior committed directly within court premises." Before the sentence finished, the entire courtroom seemed to stretch under an invisible shock wave. A few spectators raised their eyebrows, some clerks paused mid-sentence, and Rick, who still stood in the center of it all, appeared utterly frozen, his face turned pale, lips parted in a rigid state, not from disbelief, but from a truth that hit too fast and left no room to deny. A strangled sound escaped his throat. "You've got to be kidding." The words shattered into the air like something that had broken loose. "I'm the one upholding justice here." Julius looked directly at Rick, and his eyes now held neither observation nor pity. It was simply the look of a man who had sat through far too many trials, enough to distinguish between outrage born of innocence and the flailing of someone who refused to face reality. "Precisely because you hold that position," Julius replied slowly, "your abuse of power cannot be taken lightly." Rick shook his head repeatedly, arms spread as if to validate himself to the entire room. But his hands no longer carried the firmness of that morning. His fingers trembled, shoulders hunched forward. "I was following professional instinct," he shouted. "I didn't know she was an agent. I didn't know." "And because you didn't know, you thought you had the right to trample?" Julius interrupted without raising his voice. "You acted without protocol, without verification, and during that process, you spoke slurs that you now don't dare repeat. You stand here, Rick Halverson, not as a guardian of justice, but as its distortion." That declaration tore clean through everything Rick thought he stood for. The courtroom fell into a cruel silence. 2 internal security officers stepped forward from the right door, neither speaking, gently placing their hands on Rick's shoulders as if he were someone too dazed to be left alone. Rick didn't resist. He turned to look at Solene one last time, his face twisted between collapse and fury too raw to articulate. But Solene didn't look back. She had no more need to speak. What had to be said had already been left on the bench in the form of that gleaming badge. And as Rick was led away, that symbol remained untouched. Not a piece of evidence, but a marker of a boundary no longer hidden. A court officer approached from the left of the bench, his movement precise, no excess, unhooking Rick's firearm in full view of the courtroom. Rick jerked instinctively, but no force was needed. Every step of the procedure followed exact regulation, swift, clean, and cold as forged steel. When the steel cuffs clicked open, the metal tapped gently against the bench, compressing the room into a single held breath. Rick struggled, trying to balance as his arms were pulled behind him. He growled, his voice cracked and bitter. "You people do this to me over some black bitch?" His voice burst into the frozen atmosphere, sharp, chaotic, poisoned by a humiliation he could no longer swallow. Those words were no longer a mistake. They were the raw essence of someone who believed he was untouchable. No one responded. No counter-arguments, no legal explanations. The courtroom sank into a state that everyone understood. Some words need no reply, because silence itself draws the clearest line between those who stand for justice and those who are left behind. Celine did not move. She remained exactly where she stood, her expression unchanged. Her eyes, from beginning to end, stayed fixed on a single straight line, like a cold needle piercing precisely where Rick's wrist trembled inside the cold silver cuffs. Nothing more needed to be said. No mockery, no lecture. Rick's own behavior was the most powerful indictment against him, and it was Soline's gaze that turned each twitch of his hand into an alarm bell for a system that had enabled men like him for far too long. Each step Rick took as he was led away echoed unpleasantly on the tiled floor. His shoes no longer struck with rhythm like they had when he dragged Soline across the courthouse yard. Now each footfall was offbeat, each step a shift in balance from a body unaccustomed to being restrained, unaccustomed to being seen as the one needing control. Julius Wainwright remained seated at the bench, his hand resting on the wooden gavel as if the room's breathing aligned with his every movement. But there was no need for further intervention. Everything had revealed itself, from recklessness to insult, from shouting to the final slur. It had all come from one man, and now that man no longer wore a uniform, no longer held command, and no longer had protection from the system he had once manipulated. A court officer stepped back with a file in hand, making no sound. The witnesses turned one by one to look at Soline. Some nodded, others remained silent, but all understood clearly. She did not need applause or a burst of celebration. The sight of Rick in handcuffs at the center of the courtroom, his final shout swallowed by a heavy silence, was the true conclusion to what he had caused. And in the middle of that room, Soline still stood firm, the one unmoving anchor amid the final tremor of a system just beginning to wake. That afternoon, only a few hours after Rick Halverson was escorted out of the courtroom, stripped of every last shred of identity, a video capturing him dragging Soline down the courthouse hallway surfaced on 3 national television channels. Every frame appeared, her cold face, her fixed eyes when pushed against the wall, and his distorted screaming voice, all recorded with breath-level clarity. Within 4 hours, views surpassed 700,000. Social media began flooding with angry posts, shared clips, and frame-by-frame breakdowns analyzing it like a piece of criminal evidence with national implications. Headline after headline rose to the top of search pages, stacked and jostling as if trying to scream out a truth long buried. Federal agent dragged like a criminal just for being a black woman, blazed in red across the homepage of an independent news outlet. Alongside it, a mainstream channel declared, "White cop slaps justice in the face inside the nation's sacred hall." People discussed Soline's gaze, her composed posture in the face of blatant abuse of power, the way she never screamed or fought back with violence, but let the entire system collapse under the weight of her logical presence. Analysts compared Rick's behavior to previous cases where officers had crossed lines with people of color and were shielded by vague reports. But this time there was no room for ambiguity. Security footage, eyewitnesses, federal records, the shining silver badge on the bench, every detail hammered into a structure already long crumbling. Civil rights groups responded almost instantly. Color of Change issued a statement just minutes after the video spread. "This is not an isolated incident. This is the direct manifestation of a system that lets arrogance wear the badge of law to insult, humiliate, and suppress." The hashtag bearing Soline Ward's name began trending, pulling in response videos from lawyers, former judges, and even ex-officers who had left the system to critique it from the outside. An emergency meeting was held that very evening at the Department of Justice Administrative Headquarters. Large screens replayed the entire sequence of events, from the courtyard hallway to the moment Rick was handcuffed. The internal investigation team was forced to address the media about how an officer like Rick had remained in the system for so many years without serious scrutiny. And by the time the meeting ended, reporters were already waiting outside, cameras rolling, microphones branded with the logos of major national broadcasters. Soline did not reappear in the media. She gave no interviews and held no press conferences. But her image, her stance in the courtroom, her eyes fixed on the wrist of the man who once thought he was the law, had already become the emblem of a day when the justice system was forced to see itself. Less than 24 hours after the incident, the Internal Investigation Bureau officially opened a file marked Emergency Level 3 to review Rick Halverson's conduct in full. The phrase might have sounded procedural, but to the public it simply meant the system admitting that one officer had crossed the line and now had to be pulled back. Yet, instead of calming the outrage, the move only fueled the fire spreading across every social platform by the hour. During the Bureau's very first press briefing, a reporter from a major investigative outlet stood up mid-room, raised an old file, and asked loudly, "Why did Rick Halverson retain his post after 3 racial misconduct complaints in 3 years? And why was he assigned to a federal courthouse?" The question made the Bureau's solid pores pause for a few seconds, lips pressed tight, before answering in a tense voice, "We will be reviewing the entire personnel vetting process." Immediately, that response was clipped, edited into a short video, and circulated widely, becoming the focal point of a backlash even greater than the event of Rick being handcuffed. Political commentators argued it could no longer be called a personal error if the pattern had been prolonged and repeated. They dug through every internal report, every promotion Rick had received, every line in older investigation files. An independent investigative outlet even published that, in a case the previous year, Rick had been recommended for a 7-day suspension. But the penalty was ultimately reduced to a counseling session. Outside the chaos of media and social reaction, Solene Ward remained silent. She did not reappear anywhere, nor did she release any personal statements. For 2 days, reporters lined up outside the federal building, cameras pointed toward the glass doors. Anchors in suits, delivering live updates as if waiting for a response from the one person who had said nothing since shaking the courtroom. But the federal office released only one brief line through the press secretary. "Agent Ward is assisting with the investigation. She does not need to say anything further." That single sentence made Solene's silence more powerful than any statement. It served as a way to hold her position, a message that everything necessary had already been revealed in court, and now it was time for the system to confront what it had long attempted to hide. Legal analysts immediately labeled it strategic silence, a conscious decision not to engage with the media to preserve investigative focus and maintain the legal depth of the matter. Meanwhile, protests began emerging in major cities. People held up images of Solene in the courtroom, her hand placing the badge on the table with bold text beneath, "She didn't need to shout. Truth was loud enough." Other signs clearly displayed Rick Halverson's name, his year of appointment, the number of complaints filed, alongside a large question, how many more haven't surfaced? It wasn't just Rick under scrutiny. The entire personnel oversight system of the Department of Justice came under review. A campaign for public data transparency was being proposed, requiring all complaints, closed or ongoing, to be listed for community oversight. Many political figures hesitated to defend Rick. Even those who had once backed increased police funding began to pull back, wary of being associated with a model of distorted authority. All those reactions centered on a single morning in a courthouse hallway, where a woman had been dragged amid shouted orders and degrading remarks. But now, her silence had become the loudest voice. Solene did not need to respond. She had said enough, and the entire system was now being forced to face it. Every word, every action, every glance once assumed safe from scrutiny. Inside a secured room on the 6th floor of District 4's headquarters, federal officials gathered around a round table. The lighting narrowed to a single projection screen. No press, no cameras, just high-level operatives reviewing Solene Ward's restricted file. Each page stamped with red annotations and access codes beyond standard clearance. "This is B74, said a domestic affairs officer, voice low but firm, activated only during federal emergencies or when classified personnel are compromised. Solene's record played on screen, covert assignments, interagency coordination across distrustful units, precision in sensitive operations. She had bridged gaps where others failed. A senior officer leaned in, his tone weighted. "She's not just an agent. She's the core of a top-secret surveillance initiative." The room stilled. The program he referred to had exposed underground power networks manipulating local law enforcement. Few even knew it existed, fewer still could access it. An FBI deputy director tapped the table. "With her, this goes far beyond apology," he said, instructing legal staff to review every file linked to Rick's prior jurisdictions. "If we find overlaps with Eastern Region intel, we may be looking at systemic concealment." Heads nodded. Soline's case wasn't just mishandled, it exposed how someone like Rick could move unchecked. "She didn't choose silence," a security advisor added. "It was strategic, and now the system speaks in her place." Within hours, directives were issued. Vet all prior interactions with special agents, reopen old complaints, and audit the integrity of ongoing surveillance efforts. After Soline, blind faith in procedural safeguards no longer held. Just before the meeting ended, a man in a gray suit asked the question that paused the room. Did she intend for Rick to make contact? The reply came fast, cold, and final. She didn't need to. The guilty always reveal themselves. Soline hadn't baited anyone. Simply doing her job was enough to unmask the flaws. And the system, left unchecked, had betrayed itself through its most primitive instincts: suspicion, intrusion, and the public degradation of a black woman lawfully doing her duty. The chief supervisor glanced around the table, then placed a photograph down. It was a frame from surveillance footage, showing Rick pinning her against the wall, his gun holstered at his side, his face twisted in fury. No one directed that behavior. No signal from Soline provoked such a response. It was pure exposure. A police officer with distorted beliefs, convinced that the uniform granted him authority beyond structure. "This case is not simply a misunderstanding," the chief continued. "It is evidence of a behavioral pattern that has long persisted within the system. And this time, we're lucky there was a camera. But how many other times weren't there?" A personnel records officer nodded slowly. He opened Rick's file and pointed to 3 prior complaints, 2 involving black residents held for more than 4 hours without legal justification, 1 involving verbal threats during an interrogation with a female witness. All had been classified as insufficient evidence for action. Now, viewed alongside the courtroom conduct, the entire system was forced to re-examine how it monitors its enforcement agents. A senior official from the Department of Justice concluded the session. Soline didn't need to drag Rick into error. She stood there, in her role by protocol. It was the system itself that stumbled over her presence. And if we don't change our approach, these stumbles will continue, but with far greater consequences. The meeting ended with strong consensus. Any act of intimidation by law enforcement will no longer be treated as internal handling. A new interdepartmental protocol will be established. And Soline, though she never spoke a word, has become the catalyst for that shift, not through a speech, but through the precision of her every step. That morning, in front of the city police headquarters, a long line of people stood under the scorching sun. In their hands were large boards painted in bold white letters, "We are Soline." It was a declaration from hundreds of individuals across all walks of life, united in response to how the justice system had exposed its failure in a single morning at court. Among the crowd stood a former black judge in a plain gray shirt, holding a sign with a solemn gaze fixed on the building. Beside him was an elderly veteran with silver hair and a chest full of medals, standing next to law students still wearing backpacks. A generational chain had formed, from those who once sat behind the bench to those now learning how to rebuild the system from within. Cameras pointed at the crowd, capturing every moment of quiet resolve. No chants, no loudspeakers, only presence. One reporter whispered, "Never seen a protest without megaphones that could bring a whole block to a standstill." Perhaps silence was weight enough. Each sign was an unspoken indictment aimed at a force that once believed power could excuse injustice. That same afternoon, footage of Rick Halverson shouting, his face red as he dragged Soline into court, was spliced with the calm look in her eyes as she placed the badge on the bench. 2 faces at 2 extremes, 2 responses to power, 2 worlds clashing at the heart of a democracy that claimed to be equal. The image spread online at lightning speed. It appeared on T-shirts in community forums and became a new symbol of the police force's moral decay. "Rick is everything we need to root out," one comment on a legal forum read. "Not just because he abused power, but because he was protected after 3 previous complaints. A system that lets him remain is a system that feeds wrongdoing." Young people began referring to the phenomenon as the Solene effect, where one person's silence became a tidal wave against the power structure. Law schools added her case to their curriculum. A communications department invited experts to analyze how a single gaze could dismantle a carefully crafted police image. Meanwhile, the police force itself showed clear divisions. Some younger officers quietly emailed their support for Solene, saying her composure and principles gave them hope the profession could still be redeemed. But loyalists to the old guard were angry, calling her a provocateur, despite her silence in the media. Ironically, what they feared had never come from any provocation, only from the presence of a black woman who walked into power with full legitimacy and did not back down. As the sun dipped behind the square, the image of Rick and Solene was displayed on a massive LED screen opposite police headquarters, like a mirror no one could avoid. And in that reflection, each person, from officers to officials, had to ask themselves, if I were standing there, who would I be? In front of a local news camera, a young woman stood amid the protesters, bright eyes behind thin glasses, her curly hair tied back. She held no sign, wore no hat for shade, just looked straight into the lens when asked how she felt. Her voice did not waver, but it carried a quiet force that made listeners swallow hard. If a federal agent can be treated like that, how many nameless people have been suffocated without a sound? That question was never meant to be answered. It was aimed directly at the foundation of what people called justice. The video of her words was shared hundreds of thousands of times. In the comment sections, personal stories began pouring in. A teacher pulled from her car while driving her child to school. A man handcuffed in his yard for reporting a burglary. A student struck in the back of the head at a subway station for wearing a hoodie. Each story ended with the same line: no one was prosecuted. The outrage did not stem from punches or insults. It came from how such actions vanished as though they had never occurred. National media outlets simultaneously broadcast the newly released statistics from the Independent Criminal Justice Oversight Organization. According to the report, over 60% of police use of force incidents involving black citizens never make it to trial. Of those, nearly 80% are never officially reported by the involved police departments. That number struck directly at the belief held by many that, as long as laws exist, justice will follow. But laws do not function through words alone. They function through the people who enforce them. And if that person believes skin color is a reason for suspicion, then every regulation is nothing more than a blank page. A veteran editor at the National News Network wrote in his commentary column, "Rick Halverson is not an outlier. He is a faithful representation of a system that allowed the wrong to become the standard." That sentence was quoted repeatedly on late-night discussion programs, pushing the conversation beyond Solene's case and into the recurring behavioral structure of a force that is armed but lacks substantive oversight. Legal experts across the board called for full disclosure of internal police statistics in every state, from complaint records to investigation outcomes. An independent survey also showed that public trust in law enforcement had dropped by more than 30% in the 2 weeks following the incident. That decline did not come from a single video or Solene's cold stare when facing Rick, but from the realization that the public's silence had long allowed others to speak on their behalf and redefine the boundary between order and authoritarianism. The question posed by that young woman continued to echo through classroom debates, coffee shop conversations, and even closed-door legislative meetings. Because now everyone was asking themselves, if a federal agent has to be dragged before the public and only gains respect after declaring her title, then who is this justice truly serving? And if the system continues to shield names like Rick, does it still deserve to be called justice at all? Rick sat in the first-floor interrogation room, where the gray-painted walls had faded and fluorescent lights glared down on a chipped metal table. His police uniform was gone, replaced with a wrinkled civilian-issue outfit that hung loose on his frame. The collar was stained with sweat, and his hair clumped in oily strands, far removed from the man who once strode boldly through the courthouse. His hands rested in front of him, neck veins tense, as if clinging to the last thing left inside. His eyes didn't meet anyone else's, fixed instead on a faint crack running along the table, reflecting a fatigue unclear whether from exhaustion or belated reckoning. "I used to be commended," he said, voice hoarse, almost a whisper. No one interrupted him, neither the two investigators nor the behavioral monitor, letting him drift through his stream of self-defense. "I used to catch criminals, took part in a hostage rescue, and was honored on stage during a ceremony attended by a city council member. I'm not a monster." His voice rose slightly on those last three words, as if betting that volume alone could bend reality. But no one responded. One of the investigators simply folded his arms, resting his chin on his hand, watching Rick as if through glass. Beneath all the words, everyone in the room could see Rick clinging to fragments of self-procedure, resisting the new portrait being forced upon him. A white man, once empowered and shielded by the system, now had to explain why he stopped a black woman in a suit outside a courthouse, dragged her in without paperwork or cause, and humiliated her in front of a judge. Rick repeated statements as though emphasis could make them true. He spoke of sleepless nights on duty, returning a lost child to their parents, and helping an elderly man who fell at an intersection. These memories were pulled up like barricades, as if a few acts of decency could erase the shadow. But his words faltered, his rhythm broke. After each tale of good deeds, his gaze fell back to the cold metal table, as if waiting for confirmation from something that never answered. Eventually, the investigator leaned forward and opened the internal report, saying nothing as he flipped through the pages. The rustle of paper was steady. He paused at one line, then looked up. "You're aware of the previous 3 incidents, aren't you? 3 complaints about your use of force against people of color, all dismissed for lack of evidence." Rick froze, blinking slowly, the veins in his neck pulsing. "I don't remember clearly. Some provoked me first," he mumbled, then added weakly, "I don't think I'm a racist. I was just acting on instinct, on professional intuition." "That instinct is what made you drag a federal agent into court without verifying her identity," the investigator replied, voice calm but piercing. "And if she hadn't been who she was, just an ordinary person, would you still be sitting here trying to justify yourself today?" Rick lowered his head, his hands twitching. He had no more answers. He knew, and everyone in the room knew, that the one undeniable truth was that he had laid hands on the justice system as if it belonged to him, and this time the system was forced to respond. The investigator leaned back in his chair, eyes still on Rick's shrinking figure. No words of comfort, no softness in tone. He spoke evenly, decisively, as if delivering a conclusion drawn from over 2 decades of internal affairs experience. "You were once carried on shoulders for catching the right person. Now you're lying on the ground for grabbing the wrong one." A short sentence, yet it weighed down the room like a slab of stone dropped onto the heart of the truth. Rick gasped, breath catching in his throat, teeth clenched tight. The mask of control had slipped. What remained was a man unraveling, forced to answer like the accused instead of the authority. Face flushed, eyes unfocused, he stared at the floor as if hoping it held an answer he had never learned while wearing the badge. Suddenly, he shot up, slammed his hand on the metal table. "It's because she's a black woman," he shouted, neck veins bulging. "I don't believe someone like her should have that kind of power." The words tore out, burning from within, and with that, silence filled the room. No one responded. They didn't need to. Everything Rick had done, from the start, spoke for itself. He hadn't acted on reason or law, but on bias, on the belief that someone could be a threat just by standing firm, calm, and black. Now he had said it aloud, sealing his fate. The investigator closed the file, stood, and said only one thing before leaving. "That's all we need." The door shut behind him. Rick sat alone, cold and hunched, the camera above still rolling. No more shouting, no more authority. Just a man undone by his own choices, facing a truth no badge could protect him from. Soline's silence, more powerful than any verdict, echoed in the room, and in it, Rick finally saw the trial had already ended. A 3-page memorandum was delivered on Monday morning, marked with a federal security seal. Its heading read clearly, "Report on Recurrent Misconduct at District 6 Courthouse." The author was Solene Ward, signed in a thin but firm hand, so precise that no recipient could overlook it. Rather than speaking to the media or holding a press conference, she sent the document directly to the Judicial Committee, with copies forwarded to 4 independent oversight agencies, ensuring that even if some tried to ignore it, others would preserve the truth in full view. At the start, Solene made no mention of her incident. She wrote quietly, clearly, as if what happened to her was only one link in a longer, more silent chain. In the opening section, she listed the names of 11 police officers previously accused of misconduct against black women within the courthouse and its surrounding areas. Each name came with excerpts from case files, dates, and copies of witness statements that had once been excluded from official records. The most striking part of the document lay in its middle. Solene presented 7 cases she believed had been suppressed, each one labeled as legally obtained from internal archive. Included were unpublished audio recordings, security footage removed from files, and victim complaints dismissed for lacking grounds of violation. Each piece of evidence was strung together like a closed loop, only this time the one breaking it apart was an agent who knew the system's weaknesses inside and out. The final part of the memorandum was a short but weighty conclusion. She issued no formal accusations and requested no immediate prosecutions. Instead, Solene wrote, "When the law functions as a curtain, those behind it remain safe. But if light is allowed through, even the curtain must answer for shielding the dark." That sentence led several Judicial Committee members to reread it, not from confusion, but because they had never encountered a line so calm yet so ruthless in tone. Within 24 hours of its receipt, an emergency meeting was convened. Committee members gave their remarks, most agreeing that the data and evidence warranted a special investigation. Some proposed publicly naming the officers listed, while others pushed to expand inquiries into neighboring districts. Solene Ward's name was mentioned repeatedly, not only because of her position, but because of her method of exposure, precise without inciting chaos. Each page served as a courtroom verdict in itself, requiring only a reader with a conscience. That same night, civil rights organizations began circulating a summary of the memo online. Stories once dismissed year after year began connecting. One woman, whose complaint had been rejected due to unreliable memory, now saw her testimony cited in the 3rd section of the memo. She wrote online, "I thought no one remembered my voice, but someone did." Solene stayed out of the spotlight, declining every interview. Yet within 2 days, her report had become foundational reading, passed among lawyers, law students, victim advocacy groups, and those who once stayed silent out of fear. When one officer named in the report was placed on administrative leave pending investigation, the system understood this shock would not fade with time. It was a warning, with fingerprints, timestamps, and a permanence no file could erase. The independent investigation began Friday morning, after Solene Ward's documents were verified by 3 separate oversight bodies. Led by a senior inspector unaffiliated with District 6, the team was appointed by the state. That same day, 3 officers named in her report were ordered to surrender their badges and weapons under temporary suspension, pending data review and witness verification. The move was swift. No press release, no media notice. The news spread rapidly, from a quiet midday headline to the top of major outlets. Analysts re-examined complaint records from the past 7 years. Several dismissed cases now matched Solene's notes. Missing footage, altered timestamps, tampered reports. Each discovery peeled back a pattern too consistent to ignore. While the media chased the story, Solene Ward remained absent. Articles named her the one who broke the silence, yet no quote was ever found. Cameras waited outside federal buildings, but all they captured was a calm black woman walking by, never stopping. No words, no avoidance, just quiet, unwavering presence. Reporters dubbed her the Silent Phantom, not to mystify, but to mark a shift. A woman dragged and humiliated in public who chose not to speak back with outrage, but with proof. Her silence, in a world built on noise, spoke louder than any defense. On forums, people called it a new form of protest. firm, restrained, and undeniable. A lawyer who once criticized her later said, "I thought silence was weakness." Solane Ward showed it can be the clearest way to let truth stand alone. As the three officers awaited hearings, all eyes stayed on the woman who never said a word, still visible and still making the system listen. At a closed meeting of the city's police department, the usual circle of chairs seemed to tighten as the conversation grew tense. A tall white lieutenant stood up, his voice cracking with anger, waving at the morning news clip just played on the screen. "We're being lumped together with a man who lost control, a reckless lunatic, and now the whole force is seen as a stain." A few people in the room nodded slightly, perhaps out of fatigue, perhaps from fear that public outrage was spiraling too fast. But from the back row, Sergeant Jerome Caldwell, a 15-year veteran of the force, sat upright, eyes sharp like a blade just drawn from its sheath. He didn't wait for permission to speak. His voice was clear, each word slicing into the wall of blind defense being raised. "That's not being lumped together, that's exposure. You know why? Because we reported. We named names, but you brushed it off, signed it away, or laughed like it was too petty to bother the internal review." The room fell quiet for several seconds. No one spoke, but glances bounced around, then avoided each other, as if everyone had heard or seen something before, but never dared to bring it up. Jerome continued. He turned toward the captain, who had just recently claimed in interviews that the department needed to control the narrative before it damages public trust. Jerome's words came slowly, cold, and firm. "If we are the dark blood of this machine, then you are the white hands gripping the valve to keep it from leaking into the light. And now that light hits your face, you want to turn away and call it an accident?" Another officer, an Asian woman seated near the center, spoke in a soft but steady voice. "I used to think silence was safety, but since the Solane Ward case went public, I realized my silence was used to cover up misconduct. No one is being lumped together unless they stayed silent when they saw something wrong happening." Her words rippled through the room. Some sighed, some tilted their heads, and a few simply looked down at their own hands, not out of guilt, but because, for the first time, they understood that public outrage wasn't aimed at individuals, it was aimed at how an entire system responds when misconduct is exposed. A senior inspector, long silent, rose slowly, his tone measured. "I've seen many trials, many investigations, but I've never seen anyone like Solane Ward. She didn't need to carry a sign or take a minute of the live broadcast, just a memo, a badge placed at the right moment, and we, the ones always demanding respect, suddenly found ourselves reflected in the mirror we had hung." No one replied, but in a few eyes something shifted. Some recalled moments of colleagues yelling too loudly. Others remembered files closed too quickly in drawers. One looked at Jerome, then gave a silent nod. The meeting room was no longer a place for sides. It became a chamber reflecting the honesty each person had to face alone. And in that fleeting moment, a crack opened in the wall of denial. A crack Solane had carved, not with a voice, but with actions sharp enough to make denial impossible. Even if some walked away from that conversation, they could not return to what was before, because someone had named silence as complicity, and this time the voices came from those who had endured silence the longest. The internal meeting at District 6 Police Department was planned to last 20 minutes, focused on media response adjustments. But once the door closed, tensions erupted. Questions about Rick Halverson, supervisory lapses, and delayed oversight turned into blame. A young officer, only 3 years in, stood up, voice shaking. "We're not here to defend anyone. We're here to ask why this happened more than once and no one answered for it." Her words hit the veterans, those who had signed off on Rick's records, dismissed complaints for lack of evidence. No one pushed back. They looked down, clutched their notebooks, silent. A longtime lieutenant stood, voice low. "Last year I saw a black woman searched 3 times in an hour. Rick gave the order. I didn't question it. I was afraid of being isolated, of being labeled. But Solane wasn't," he choked up. "She had the courage I did." Across the table, a white officer with over 2 decades of service said, "We've stayed silent to keep our seats, but now Silence burns faster than any scandal. A training supervisor added dryly, "This isn't the last straw. The glass shattered. We're bleeding." No one tracked time. No one mentioned the media anymore. They knew this wasn't about fixing statements. It was about facing a system that claimed to uphold justice but let the truth decay under silence. That morning, the local newspaper printed a large photo on its front page, showing the backlot of a 2014 gun fair. Among a group wearing T-shirts reading "Pure Nation," Rick Halverson stood upright, one hand on the AR-15 slung across his shoulder, a half smile aimed directly at the lens. Behind him, a Confederate battle flag stretched across the background, its symbolism of racial division stark as ink on a record the justice system had long tried to bleach out. The article stated that the photo had not been discovered through any internal review, but came from a civilian forum archiving evidence of racism within law enforcement. It was posted by someone who had been subjected to Rick's excessive scrutiny 3 years earlier. Soon after, social media users unearthed a string of old posts from an account matching Rick's name, including several statements hinting at white supremacist ideology and caustic remarks targeting people of color. But what truly shocked the public was not what was found online. It was the system's long-standing silence in the face of it. By noon, a leaked internal document from 2016 confirmed Rick had been reported by a Howard Law student for using offensive language while stationed on a campus security detail. The incident report read, "The accused referred to 2 black students as freeloading creatures and threatened to search their bags if they kept acting like this was their home turf." Yet the case was closed with the note, "Due to lack of direct video evidence and no independent third-party witnesses, the matter lacks grounds for disciplinary action." The information spread rapidly through social networks, especially within groups of current and former students of color. Posts were shared at lightning speed. The prevailing question, echoed everywhere, if the system had a chance to see Rick 8 years ago, how did he go on to patrol streets, issue commands, drag innocents into court, and even represent the very concept of justice? In one interview with a criminal justice policy expert, she stated, "The issue isn't the photo or the slur. It's the system's response, or lack thereof, to that photo and that slur. When a police officer reveals a racist mindset and no one calls it out, he's not acting alone. He's being shielded." Articles like these left internal affairs departments with no room to offer excuses. News coverage quickly shifted focus from the courthouse incident to Rick's entire career history. Each time his name surfaced, so did questions about those who signed off on his promotions and those who ignored the red flags. In the empty office of the District 6 Police Department, Rick's nameplate had been removed, but the residue of his presence lingered in hundreds of comments, thousands of angry eyes, and the bitter silence of victims who were once disbelieved. The story of Rick Halverson was no longer about one man. It had become evident that silence could preserve a badge for 8 years, but also drag an entire system off its moral pedestal when the truth resurfaced from the very files it had tried to bury. Internal Affairs inbox crashed 3 times that morning under the flood of emails. Within 12 hours, more than 80 submissions arrived. Photos, audio clips, handwritten testimonies, and forgotten videos stored on the phones of people Rick Halverson had harassed, searched, insulted, or intimidated in quiet neighborhoods. Many had never believed their voices would carry weight. But after what happened to Solene Ward, something inside them changed. A silver badge placed on a desk, a calm voice amid a storm of abuse, an image that refused to be erased. It reawakened a faith long crushed. The black man in his 60s, once handcuffed by Rick in 2019 for standing too long near a gas station, submitted a handwritten note. The lines were shaky but clear. "I thought no one would ever believe me, but my daughter showed me the video. I cried all night. I'm not alone anymore." A medical student recalled being forced to the curb at 19 for jogging too close to the courthouse. "I thought I was crazy. Now I know I was just another name Rick saw as disposable." Audio clips surfaced, some seconds long, others minutes, catching Rick shouting, threatening, even spitting near a brown-skinned teen. Many had once saved those recordings but deleted them out of fear. Now, people were restoring files, searching old devices and cloud accounts. Piece by piece, the image grew clear. Rick Halverson wasn't a fluke. He was what the system allowed to grow unchecked. Journalists crowded the investigation office. One young reporter, eyes tired, said quietly, "Celine didn't just stand for herself. She uncovered a buried road." The line wasn't printed, but spread like the truth. It captioned countless posts, personal stories of silent humiliation, unjust searches, insults through rolled-down windows, all triggered by skin, not action. At a press conference, a human rights official confirmed the investigation would expand across District 6, reviewing 10 years of Rick's cases. A reporter asked, "Why does justice only move when a federal agent is dragged into daylight?" The question echoed, forcing city leaders to promise oversight reform. Celine Ward never spoke. No posts, no interviews. But her calm defiance, her words, "You don't need to know who I am to treat me like a human," now lit the path for others. Rick thought he held power, but the moment he grabbed her shoulder, he sparked something stronger, the right to be heard when silence finally ends. The courtroom that morning felt bleaker than any hearing in the past 3 months. The gallery was sparsely filled, with no crowd of reporters like in the early days. Rick Halverson was brought in through the side door, wearing no uniform, no handcuffs, his shoulders slumped, face damp with sweat under the yellow lights. No family was present, no handshake from former colleagues, and no eyes waiting for him to turn around. Only a public defender assigned by the state legal system, a salt-and-pepper-haired man scribbling into a thin folder, never once looking directly at his client. Rick sat down in the defendant's chair without daring to touch the table. His hands rested on his thighs, palms curved inward, as if trying to grasp something already broken. He had once walked through courtroom doors as a figure of justice, once believed his shouting passed for command. Now every movement felt redundant, every excuse drained of weight. Across from him, the prosecution's table was neatly arranged, evidence bound in folders. They did not need many words. They had footage, testimonies, internal records, and a list of those who had been targeted. In the back row, Celine Ward entered just as the gavel struck. She took a seat on the right side, near the emergency exit, not drawing attention, yet not concealing herself either. No one dared stare at her for long. Her presence echoed a sequence of events that had shifted the very foundation the courtroom once stood. She arrived not as a witness and had no statement to read. Enough people had spoken for her. Enough evidence now stood in place of a rage she had never voiced. Rick looked up and met her gaze for a brief second. He almost looked away, then stopped, his eyes holding still for the first time. There was something in that stare that wasn't hatred, nor remorse, just a void of reaction, as though he were facing a mirror reflecting everything he had tried to deny. Not because she was an agent, not because she was a black woman, but because she was living proof of what he had once claimed did not exist. The judge read the charges in a steady voice. Each count sounded like a stone tapped gently on tile. Abuse of authority, racially motivated conduct, harassment of a lawful citizen, unlawful interference with a federal operation. Rick did not object. He said nothing. It had gone too far for denial. Every insult he had once barked as an act of power was now written in the indictment, colder and more merciless than anything he had ever shouted. Celine remained still. Her eyes neither revisited the past nor searched for the future. She had come simply to witness what should have happened long ago. The room felt drained of sound. The usual rustle of papers, notes scribbled, chairs shifting, all vanished. In its place was a thick silence, a curtain drawn over everyone seated within the courtroom. Celine Ward held her gaze, not blinking, not turning, not leaning to ask a question. Her face resembled a morning lake, so still it unsettled anyone who stared too long. No one knew what she was thinking, only that her eyes lay over Rick like soundproof glass. Not angry, not triumphant, just verifying the outcome of a test that had once been run. Rick Halverson sat hunched in the defendant's chair, back slightly curled, hands glued to his knees. His face held no clear expression, only a layered daze growing with every second. When the prosecutor began reading the indictment, No one in the room moved. Each charge delivered over the loudspeaker thickened the air. Even those who had remained different now held their breath, afraid to break the gravity hanging over all of them. Rick had once shouted, once pointed at Solene, calling her a polished shell, once dragged her across the courthouse lawn like spoils of war. But now he could not lift his head, could not meet any gaze, had no defense left to give. The courtroom lights shone from above, leaving no dark corner for him to hide. He no longer had a uniform to cling to, no gun belt, no radio, through which his voice once carried weight. Everything that once symbolized his power now stood as archived evidence. Solene did not close her eyes. She did not need to recall. Every word Rick had yelled, every grip of the wrist, every inch he had leaned in was etched into the core of the case. The court officer coughed gently, but the entire courtroom turned toward him at once. Everyone present knew this was not just another trial. This was the first time every shadow had been dragged into the light without a curtain left to pull. And Rick, who once believed law could be bent by volume and skin color, now faced the real version, one no longer on his side. Judge Julius Wainwright flipped to the final page of the file and read aloud each word. Rick's back stiffened, his neck shrank into the collar of his shirt that no longer held its crease. Solene was still there, her eyes were still fixed on him, as if everything was only beginning. No curses, no contempt. Her silence was the loudest voice in the room. By the end of the reading, Rick had yet to lift his head. His bowed posture came not from regret, but from the weight of a reality he had never imagined confronting. As each name of those he had wronged echoed like silent indictments, he began to understand. No forgetting is forever, and no one can stand in the light while holding on to the right to scorn. The auditorium of the Civil Rights Institute was packed, every seat filled from the front row to the doors. Journalists crowded to the right side, while to the left sat those who had signed the petition demanding a deeper investigation into the Rick Halverson case. The screen behind the podium displayed a simple phrase, "Dialogue on Justice in Enforcement." No effects, no decoration, just an atmosphere thick with anticipation, waiting for one woman to rise from the tug-of-war with the system. Solene Ward stepped onto the podium in gray shoes, her hair neatly tied behind her neck, shoulders squared as if no pull had ever tried to drag them down. She held no paper, didn't glance at the screen, and had no assistant adjusting the microphone. She stood beneath the lights as if the very air around her held her steady. When her voice emerged, the entire room fell silent, as though everyone was waiting for either an affirmation or a rejection. "I don't represent anyone," she began, her tone low and steady, each word clear like it struck directly into the listeners' chests. "I don't want to be a symbol. I don't want to be painted on banners. I am just a consequence, a chemical reaction that was bound to happen after thousands of silences accumulated in the same system. A few heads lowered slightly, and a few pens paused mid-sentence. Solene didn't wait for applause. She spoke as if reciting a formula, not for understanding, but for memory. No one should lose their citizenship rights because of their skin tone. No one deserves to be dragged like an object for inspection, but no one has the right to believe a badge will forever protect wrongful conduct. Light from above cast shadows down onto the front row, where a senator sat motionless like carved stone. All concepts of rank were left outside the doors that day. Inside, there were only those who had experienced and those who had ignored. I was trained to observe, analyze, collect data, but no system needs data to see that hatred has become the standard. The problem isn't a man named Rick Halverson. The problem is that everyone once treated him as the standard. The room began to hum, not from volume but from tone. She wasn't angry, didn't use lofty language, but each fracture of society was being named without a chance to hide. I don't need to be celebrated. I just need people like me to be seen as human before they have to flash a badge to prove they're not an anomaly. Her voice dropped on the final sentence. She stepped down from the podium as if leaving behind only what was necessary. No one applauded immediately. It took a few seconds for the room to remember how to react, and in that pause everyone realized. Some statements don't need echo because their weight alone presses on the memory of an entire system. No one in that auditorium mistook Solene Ward for someone who would end with a warm message. No one expected her to bow, thank the press, or wave goodbye. The air already knew she wasn't there to offer a digestible image, and she didn't need to. "My silence is not weakness," she said, her eyes passing over the rows, pausing at a journalist who had just set down his pen. "It's how a blade waits for the right moment to reveal its edge." The words cut clean and cold, sharp enough to turn a speech into a reckoning. Solene didn't wait for applause. She stepped off the stage like sealing a classified file, leaving no gesture behind. No bow, no glance for approval. Since the day Rick Halverson dragged her across the courthouse stone, she had known. Misplaced acceptance only delays the rupture that must come. Some officials rose reflexively, one even lifting a hand to clap, then letting it drop as she exited silently, retracing her steps. No music played, no flashes sparked. The hall outside was brighter, yet no one saw her clearly, because what she left behind wasn't an image, but a question meant to follow every agency, every room, every buried file. Sully walked slowly, shoulders square, arms at her sides, steps steady as though she'd never been dragged. People whispered her name as symbol, beacon, heroine, but her refusal of those titles disturbed them most. She didn't brand herself, didn't partner with anyone to build a stage. That made her impossible to contain, to control, to soften with empty praise. At the far end of the hall, 3 people waited, media and internal staff, but Solene didn't pause. A slight glance told them everything. There was nothing to ask, nothing owed. She wasn't there to inspire. She came because the system had gone unchallenged for too long. When the door shut behind her, an older woman whispered, "That wasn't a speaker, that was a judge." And all who heard her knew it was true, because Solene Ward hadn't delivered a speech. She had made an incision so exact that even the system couldn't locate a place to hide. The sentencing date was publicly announced. The courtroom allowed only a limited number of attendees based on a pre-approved list. On the defendant's bench, Rick Halverson kept his head lowered, eyes sunken like trenches left after a drought. A faint red mark from recently removed glasses still lingered on his forehead, as his attorney advised he should appear less defensive. But no one in the room cared about appearances anymore. The court wasn't looking at eyeglasses, it was looking at the whole man. And the verdict was read clearly, each word striking against the aged wood of the bench. Rick Halverson is sentenced to 6 years in prison for abuse of authority with racial motivation, causing significant harm to a citizen, while that individual was performing duties under federal law. Furthermore, the defendant is permanently banned from participating in any organization, unit, or activity related to law enforcement, civil service, or domestic security. A faint rustle came from the back row, perhaps someone adjusting their posture. Otherwise, the room was so silent that the breeze slipping through the doorframe could be heard. Rick did not resist, did not cry, did not scream, like the day he was handcuffed in court. All the chaos within him had crumbled into something dull, paralyzed, and resigned. Beyond the wall, the Judiciary Committee had completed a 40-page recommendation report. It proposed restructuring behavior screening protocols in public spaces, especially where race had been used as a primary reason for administrative searches or forced engagements. Examples from Rick's case were cited in detail, with notes stating, "Subjective assumptions based on identity markers are no longer acceptable. Searches cannot be tools to preserve distorted power." That recommendation was sent to every district in the state and became a foundation for the upcoming congressional hearing on retraining police forces in demographically imbalanced areas. In subsequent small forums, Rick Halverson's name was no longer referenced as an individual, but as a case study, a cautionary tale of what happens when emotion and bias replace logic and justice. 1 week after the sentencing, human rights organizations began quietly collecting reports from other courthouses. Minority groups submitted evidence of ignored remarks, unrecorded stops, and overlooked signs. The 6-year sentence wasn't closure, it was ignition. The system remained tangled, but the fractures were now undeniable. In the courtroom where Rick received his final verdict, silence settled like judgment. No applause, no tears, only the quiet presence of Solene Ward in the back row. No phone in hand, no notes, just her eyes steady on the bench, delivering a conclusion no verdict could match. Not long after, news of 3 dismissals from District 6 surfaced quietly. A clerk who altered timestamps, a lieutenant who ignored warnings, an internal inspector who buried biased reports. One by one, they were removed, not with headlines, but with absence, as if the chain had quietly unlinked itself. Soline's name was nowhere in the statements, but her absence lingered like a presence. Meeting rooms once filled now had a chair left untouched. Reports traveled through more hands. The system, once swollen with indifference, began to tighten its grip, not from pressure above, but from the fear of being seen again. Soline never returned to the public eye. No panels, no interviews. Many expected her to step into the spotlight. She didn't. Her silence unsettled more than any speech could have. Inside federal offices, no one confirmed her whereabouts. Her files were locked under tighter codes. Some believed she had withdrawn to escape commodification. Others thought she had been moved into quiet oversight, still watching, recording. Either way, the space she left behind remained defined by her choice not to fill it. Regret followed her absence, but also respect. She did not need slogans or applause. Her impact had already etched itself into the system's seams, and sometimes the most powerful act is to disappear just enough to remind power it's still being watched. In future meetings, the phrase, "the agent dragged into court," surfaced in every abuse discussion, though no one said her name aloud. They didn't need to. That name had already become a mirror held up once and never forgotten. A short email arrived at the federal office inbox. Written by a first-year law student, its tone was raw but honest, as if touching something that shifted their worldview. "You made me believe silence isn't surrender," the final line read. No request, no expectation. Yet it was printed, folded, and placed in a file drawer labeled Soline Ward, not for reply, but as a reminder of why she moved forward, without noise. In a northern correctional facility, the guard's footsteps echoed during roll call. An older man, hair now graying, looked up, eyes dimmed with time but still sharp. He glanced at his bunkmate and muttered, "The cop who put me here, he's in the next cell now." It wasn't said with triumph, just fact. The next generation might not believe justice turns full circle, but he did, because he'd seen it. Soline returned to the office 3 weeks after Rick Halverson was transferred to prison. No announcements, no greetings. She walked the administrative hall with a file under her arm, her steps steady. Same posture, same hair, same suit. But something had shifted. Each movement, each pause to adjust a file carried a weight no one could measure. Few colleagues spoke at length, not from fear but from the mirror Soline cast. She neither accused nor reminded, but her presence made clear how deeply the system had dulled the line between conduct and character. In the following weeks, more memos were signed to review protocols for public area checks. Soline's name didn't appear as the reason. Perhaps the system avoids direct credit, or perhaps everyone knew her impact lived deeper than words, in awareness. She didn't talk to the press. She worked on time, answered properly, submitted files, and left when done. Yet what she didn't say thundered louder than speeches. It roared in those who had been cornered, dragged under indifferent eyes, called by their skin before their names. And in that silence, they knew someone had stood, quiet but undeniable. In a sterile courthouse hallway, what seemed routine, a white cop escorting a quiet black woman, sparked a reckoning. Rick Halverson didn't know she was Soline Ward, a federal agent once tasked with high-risk operations. He never asked. He saw calmness, skin color, and assumed authority. But when the courtroom lights hit the silver badge she placed on the table, the illusion shattered. This wasn't about a man losing control or a woman hiding status. It was about a system built on assumption, long shielded by procedure and indifference. Rick stood trial not for an outburst, but for years of tolerated misconduct, racial slurs, buried reports, and old photos now resurfaced. Soline never called herself a victim, nor accepted praise as a hero. She submitted a detailed report, naming those who had casually misused power and disappeared. No stage, no speeches, just silence so unwavering it forced the world to listen. She didn't rally crowds. She made the system look in the mirror. Investigations followed, then protests, then questions too long ignored. How could this have gone unchecked for so long? Maybe because no one had ever stood still under humiliation without breaking. Celine did not come from heroism, but from clarity. The system only shifts when someone refuses the victim role written for them. From that hallway to a courtroom, then to a police force under fire, her presence became a blade that revealed what violence had disguised. She didn't repair the structure. She exposed it, and in doing so gave thousands permission to question what they once accepted. The lesson isn't in Rick's sentence or Celine's fame. It's in the truth that resistance doesn't always shout. Sometimes it stands upright when dragged, holds eye contact when threatened, and speaks only when the silence becomes too loud. Justice doesn't require a podium. It only needs someone strong enough not to set it down. In a world where prejudice still wears badges and titles, calm becomes defiance. And in every such moment, Celine carved a path, proof that one refusal to retreat can halt an entire chain of harm. Although she never stood on a podium of honor, Celine Ward compelled the entire system to lower its gaze and confront itself. She did not need her name on the news or a round of applause because what she left behind was never meant to shine in the spotlight. It lived in the quiet traces along every hallway she walked, in the awakening she sparked, in thousands who once believed they were alone. And perhaps, in a society that constantly demands noise, it was her unwavering silence that truly forced the world to listen.